Hi, Charmaine. It's lovely to be speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining us for this Collective Ed conference series of videos. Just for our listeners, do you mind starting with a brief introduction of yourself?
Yes, Christian, it's a pleasure to be here. I think I would describe myself as a veteran in the education sector. I hit the grand age of 60 this year and started to draw my teacher's pension. So there you go. That was a landmark moment for me this year. I started teaching in the year of the miners' strike, 1984.
Wow.
And left after a period of acting headship in 2013. And in searching for a new vocation, because teaching was definitely a vocation for me, I drew on all that sort of my passion around teaching and development, helping people grow, and decided to do a postgraduate diploma in coaching and set up my coaching business in 2016. Became an accredited executive coach in 2018, I believe. And my experience as a coach, coaching in the education sector, then led me to start a PhD. So I'm doing a PhD at Leeds Beckett University, which is hence my connection with Collective Ed, because Rachel Lofthouse is one of my supervisors. And yeah, and it's the whole, if you like, those headlines tell a story about why I'm here talking about the topic that I've chosen for this knowledge exchange.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. First of all, I don't believe what you said about your age, so I refuse to believe that. You must be doing that just in order to get your pension early. But more seriously, thank you so much for a huge contribution to the education sector. And I really admire that once you're a veteran in the education sector and you're still committed, learning more about coaching, now doing a PhD. So thank you so much. You're a wonderful role model of that commitment, that continued commitment to education. So tell me.
If somehow you can't escape it.
Yeah, thank you, Charmaine. So in terms of the topic you're going to be talking about today, can you just give us an outline of what you're most interested and passionate about?
Okay, so I think it's worth telling a little bit of a story here to explain this. So the title I gave the topic when I was invited to participate is the question, what is the role of ethics and values in the coaching conversation? And that question came to me because as a coach, coaching educators, in the whole kind of well-being discourse that we've been having about in education for the last 10 years or so, with growing sense of urgency about the mental health and well-being of not only the professionals, but also our young people.
Yeah.
I was forced to ask myself a question which I've rooted in ethics. And that question is it ethical for me to be coaching education professionals to cope, to survive in a toxic environment without challenging that environment? Because I think without asking this question, the default position is that we cite the issues that they bring to coaching many of which are manifested in symptoms of distress, become sighted in the individual. And the connection between those manifestations of distress and the environment in which our clients work becomes obscured. Mm. And I believe we need to illuminate that connection and to explore it, examine it, and test out what the limitations of our professional, well, not just the limitations, actually, the freedoms of our professional practice in relation to whatever comes out of examining and exploring that connection.
How amazing. Thank you very much. And I love the idea of looking at the limitations or perceived limitations of the role of the coach. And then on the other hand, thinking about what freedoms does a coach have, particularly working in the education sector, to, as you say, illuminate certain behaviors or processes or systems that may be contributing to distress. And I'm sure that many of the people watching this, what you've said will resonate with them if they have been coaching educators or whether they are educators themselves. So for people, either educators or coaches, what are you thinking? What are the ways forward with this ethical question?
Well, I think if I sort of locate that in relation to the PhD and some of the conversations I've been having with coaches. Mm-hmm. And I've been having conversations in a number of different arenas. So I've started to collect data for the PhD. I started a podcast.
All right.
As well, which I've been inviting coaches into conversations around ethics. And one of the key concepts is the question of ethical stress. So I'll come to that in a moment. But my PhD question is, what are the ethics of coaching for social change in oppressive contexts? Because I think that there's an evolution, a growing searching amongst coaches for a comfortable way of working with their own values, with their own ethical framework, in a way that doesn't compromise their core, what they feel is a core responsibility to client confidentiality. And this is testing the boundaries of coach neutrality, right? So one of the hallowed grounds of, if you like, one of the ethical stances of the coach is to remain impartial and neutral. But when you actually examine the way that coaches talk about their work, and actually the way that they practice their work when they start to reflect on it from an ethical standpoint, you recognize that actually some of what we call neutral and impartial aspects of the coaching stance are themselves values laden. So when we talk about coach neutrality, that in itself is a value. Mm-hmm. It's a value that honors the autonomy of the person that you're coaching.
Yeah.
However, I think what is missing is that that has the danger, if we don't take a systemic view, of seeing, let's say, client autonomy in a power-free zone. There is no such thing as power-free context. All of our clients and we ourselves live out our relationships in contexts where power impacts, inequalities in power or perceived inequalities in power, gender bias, race bias, class bias, all these biases play out, institutional culture may privilege certain ways of being over other ways of being and create intolerable tensions for people with certain ethical values and frameworks from their family of origin or from their whatever their lived experiences in the society in which they exist. So I believe that this aspect of coaching, the context in which you coach, needs to be brought into relation when we consider some of the ethical dilemmas that we're presented with in the process of coaching. Now, obviously, I'm thinking about this specifically in relation to education because that's the context in which these questions have come to me. But they're relevant in any context in which coaches work, particularly since we are in service to people who themselves are in service to organisations that have particular roles in our society. And the way in which those organisations operate in society have impacts beyond them in the wider world. You know, the financial sector, the education sector, the health service, all of these sectors use coaching, quite heavy use of coaching, and have big impacts in society. So when we practice ethics, we have a responsibility to be true to ourselves, but we also have a responsibility to the impact of how we practice in relation to others, the immediate client, the context within which the client works and in which we've contracted for our services, and then beyond that, to wider society.
Yeah. So that's amazing. So it does raise the question of the idea of who is the client almost, doesn't it? Because there's the client in the room, there's the client who may have paid for the coaching or commissioned the coaching, such as the educational organization in our conversation, and there's society and the learners in the school, and so lots of potential clients. So for and I was wondering, as you were talking, Charmaine, I do acknowledge that this probably is live for coaches working in many professional contexts, but I was just thinking as you were talking that it's probably even more alive for educators who are coaches, because I think coaches probably get into this to make things better, but so
Absolutely.
do educators. So for viewers of this chat we're having, what are the things that they can start to do to navigate some of these ethical questions that I think you've very helpfully raised right now?
Okay, so I think not only do we need to ask who is the client, they need to ask what is the client, what interests am I serving in the way in which I work with this client. So, when you go in to sit with the head teacher who's contracting you into the organisation to work with, I don't know, the senior leadership team or teachers who may be in need of support and development, how do you navigate that question of who and what are you going to be in service of? And for me, that is the most important first question to navigate, because in terms of looking at where our power, our influence as coaches lie, I believe the first place of influence we occupy is that of the contractor in of our service. And to take a passive, I am here in service of my client no matter what position is not helpful. So let's say, for example, you are a coach who's really passionate about teacher well-being. How do you contract into an organisation where you might become aware that there are practices in that organisation which are directly contributing or even indirectly contributing to a pattern of, let's say leadership failure. You know, we have a high rate of teachers and leaders leaving the profession, and that's very often related to people being pushed ahead of time into leadership roles without preparation, without support. They become casualties and either remain wounded in the system or leave the system. Is there do we have an ethical responsibility here? Particularly as when we're in an organisation, when we coach individuals, we become repositories of intelligence. We become repositories of information about the way in which that system is operating. What do we do with that information? And one of the conversations I've had with a coach who's in that situation explicitly works at contracting in the means by which she can use that information to serve the organisation, right, without compromising her, the relationship of trust with the individual that she's coaching. And obviously you have to contract that both ways, with the person paying the bill and with the client that you're coaching, because obviously that can put that individual in jeopardy. So if you're coaching someone and you're going to use the data that you collect from that for other purposes, they need to be aware of that. But also, if that person that you're coaching themselves want to change the culture. So let's have a look at a slightly different scenario here. Let's say you've contracted into an organisation and you're coaching someone who wants to intervene, wants to be a change agent, but the culture isn't necessarily receptive to that. Yeah. And that might put your client in jeopardy of, say, losing their job, being demoted, being ostracised. How do you manage that dilemma as well? So, because I don't believe that the issue is to withdraw from that. I don't believe that the answer is to withdraw from that. For me, I believe that it's something we should be inviting ourselves into becoming an active agent ourselves in relation to these questions.
Thank you so much, Charmaine. So much for people to think about, having heard this. I think you've raised some uncomfortable questions, but in a good way, some uncomfortable questions. And I like the way you've highlighted that, you know, the first thing to do is to reflect on these questions. And then the second is to think about how can the contracting be framed to allow for the sharing of the intelligence in a way that's good for the client, the organization, and the wider stakeholders. So I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm looking forward to seeing the PhD when it's complete. I think it's going to be incredibly valuable. A final thing I just wanted to note was how beautiful that painting is behind you. Can you tell us a little bit about it? I'm sure the viewers will be fascinated. It's really stunning.
Yes, it's actually painted by my sister, Carol Phillips. Oh, wow. I'll give her a big plug. Yeah. She's an art therapist and she paints sort of in her spare time. And that is a portrait of me and my daughters. So I asked her to just do a painting of me and my daughters, and that's what she came up with. Well, I'm the one in the background in the yellow skirt, and both my daughters slightly ahead of me, which I like that. I like the fact that they're ahead of me and I'm behind. It's a very, but we're each it's lovely.
Yeah, it's beautiful and obviously very meaningful, really a beautiful piece of work. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm sure the viewers are going to find it incredibly valuable. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Charmaine.
Thank you very much, Christian.